When it comes to natural pest control, we want to make sure that we draw in these beneficial insects into the landscape as early in the season as possible. And in order to effectively do that, we need two things. First is habitat, and the second is a food source. Now, different aspects on the landscape can provide these two things, right? Soil, mulch, certain types of plants, dead wood can provide a habitat or a shelter for various beneficial insects. But then the food source is also very important. Certain flowering plants also need to be on the landscape as well, because these beneficial insects also commonly feed on pollen and nectar. So we need to be able to provide these plants in order to complete that food source. So in this video, I am going to share with you 7 different plants that bloom early in the season so that they can work to draw in these beneficial insects early into the garden as soon as possible, right? So that those beneficial insects can already be on the landscape before the pests show up. So these are the 7 different early season nectaries that can be used by a lot of different beneficial insects as a food source. And you'll notice that all of these are pretty much already common weeds. You don't have to plant them, you don't have to water them, maintain them. They come up on their own, a lot of these over winter, and then will flower and set seed early in the spring. So the first plant is common Speedwell. And the reason I'm mentioning this plant first is because it is oftentimes the earliest flowering plant of the season. I've seen this plant even flower into February in this zone 6 to 7 climate. It's generally a pretty small and inconspicuous plant, so it's not going to oftentimes compete with a lot of the larger vegetable crops. So this common Speedwell will attract different kinds of flies, syrphid flies, which are really good at going after aphids and some other pest insects, and it also may attract the pearl-bordered fritillary, which is a type of butterfly. While the Speedwell is in flower, oftentimes another plant is in flower as well, and it usually grows in similar environments, and that is the bittercress. Right now, certain species are native, other species of bittercress are not native. So it kind of depends on what species you have. But nonetheless, a lot of these different kinds of bittercress will attract certain types of beneficial insects, such as aphids, syrphid flies, bumblebees, the falcate orange tip, and the spring azure. So also both the Speedwell and the bittercress, because they flower so early in the season, they're usually, for the most part, dying back before we even really plant a lot of our plants outside, right? So they can almost kind of form like a little bit of like a light mulch layer as well. And the seeds that these plants produce will just kind of lie dormant in the soil until they're ready to sprout. The Speedwell might sprout a little bit in the spring, in the summer, but especially the bittercress is not going to really sprout and grow until later on in the fall. So you're letting these plants grow, and you're also letting them kind of reseed themselves, right? So you're kind of planting your cover crop before you even plant your vegetable or cash crop. Next, we'll also have the dandelion a little bit later in the season, right? And it has those really big yellow showy flowers. It's a really beautiful sight on a landscape. I personally, I really enjoy it. I've also even done like a lot of cooking with dandelion flowers, making like pancake type things out of them, and all kinds of stuff. So overall, it's a really cool plant. The plant itself, the root can reach pretty deep into the soil. It can break up soil compaction, help to aerate and filter water into the soil profile. Even though the dandelion has a lot of these big showy flowers, I haven't exactly found it to be like the most attractive to different kinds of bees, like bumblebees or anything like that. They will visit them occasionally, but really what we're looking at that might be attracted to the dandelion flowers would be the syrphid flies, lacewings, ladybugs can also be found around dandelion plants as well. Also, sometimes certain types of really small pollinators, like I don't even know the particular type, if it's like if it's an adrenid bee or if it's a parasitic wasp, but some of those can also be found on the flowers as well. I've also seen a couple of spotted cucumber beetles on dandelion flowers early in the season as well, which is a bit of a surprise. Chickweed can be a really great plant as well. It's commonly eaten by a lot of people. I enjoy putting them into salads and things of that nature. They have a really nice, gentle flavor to them, not bitter like certain other greens, like the dandelion, but also certain beneficial insects will be attracted to this plant as well, right? So we have these syrphid flies, and we have different kinds of parasitic wasps that will go after the flowers. The chickweed can also form a nice mat of ground cover underneath different kinds of plants. This is a plant that can really tough out the colder months of the season, right, the winter time, and it can really provide a nutritious food source for me throughout the winter time and early in the spring, and then it can also bring in those beneficial insects as well. Also, the dense nature that it has of forming like a carpet type thing can also be a really good habitat for certain types of spiders and other predatory beetles that will go after certain pest insects as well. Next on the list, we have the golden alexanders. Now, the golden alexanders, they flower a little bit later in the season than most of these other plants, but because they are an umbelliferous plant, right, so they produce those flower umbels, they can be a very valuable food source for a lot of these beneficial insects. And it's also a native plant. And because it's a native plant, it has formed associations with different kinds of native pollinators, like different species of native bees, and then also certain types of butterflies, right? Like the black swallowtail or the ozark. Usually that's going to be the caterpillar stage of these butterflies that will be feeding on the foliage. So we also have dead nettle, right, or purple dead nettle. This plant is an early season plant, right along with the, it'll flower a little bit after the Speedwell and the bitter crust, but it produces those long flowers, right, and the nectar is kind of like at the end of this tube, you know, of that's in the flower. And so it's going to especially benefit certain types of long-tongued bees, right? So we're talking about like especially like bumblebees, honeybees may also visit it, and also the giant bee fly, which can also access the nectar at the base of that flower. Additionally, we'll also get some syrphid flies and parasitic wasps visiting the purple dead nettle. As a side note, we also might see like the dead nettle to be kind of a weird name, but basically it may look like nettle to some people, even though the actual nettle itself is usually quite a bit larger. But earlier in the season they can kind of look a little somewhat similar, but it's referred to as dead nettle because it doesn't produce any of those stinging hairs that actual true nettle does. Next, we also have the ground ivy plant, right? This is not a native plant. Can also be pretty invasive in a lot of situations, especially in North America, but in moderate amounts in the landscape, it can also, I found it to really draw in a lot of bees, right? Especially like bumblebees. Now, it might not always be necessarily the most efficient food source for these bumblebees, right? Because evidently the ground ivy does not partition nectar in its flowers equally, so certain flowers will actually produce a lot more nectar, and it's usually very few of them that do, whereas the rest of them don't produce nearly as much nectar, right? And so the bees aren't going to get as much energy from them. But then there are also some potential findings that it's not necessarily that big of a deal, but as long as you're not letting it take over the landscape, you're keeping it in check. It's producing biomass that you can compost, and then when it does flower, it brings in these beneficial bees, the bumblebees, the honeybees, sweat bees, those types of things. So if you can use the ground ivy to bring in the pollinators, but you also have a diversity of other flowering plants to also support those pollinators as well, then you get a good, rich diversity of nectar sources so that these bees can continue to be healthy and thrive. So overall, this list is probably in reality very much incomplete, right? This list is not exhaustive. I'm sure that there can be so many different beneficial insects that I haven't even touched on that can be attracted to these 7 different plants, but you know, that's really one thing that we'll have to continue to keep an eye out on in the future, right? That's where observation comes in, right? Letting some of these plants grow and just sitting there and observing what insects visit these plants. So into the future, this list of beneficial insects can continue to grow as we continue to observe, as we continue to become more aware. Attracting beneficial insects, this is kind of a relatively new concept for modern agriculture, right? So a lot of the research, a lot of the experimentation, it's really in its early phases, and we have so much more to learn and to become aware of, because nature functions in complex systems, and it can really take a lifetime to understand and piece together these systems so that we get a good idea of the whole picture. Also, I want to note that certain of these plants can also attract certain types of pests, insect pests. But like what I said in the beginning, is that we need to have some of those pests on the landscape so that it can support the populations of these beneficial insects. Because the beneficial insects also use the pest insects as a food source as well, right? So immediately when you see a pest, you don't want to automatically think of it as a bad thing, right? We've been conditioned to think that, right? To really develop that fear when we see them. But oftentimes we also have to kind of take a step back and let nature do her thing. And as long as we're building a diverse and complex system, an ecosystem that can really support all these different beneficial insects, then more often than not, all the natural checks and balances will be in place, and we can function with a relatively low numbers of insect pests on the landscape. So thank you so much for checking out this video on beneficial insects and 7 early season plants that can attract them. Like I said, attracting beneficial insects into the garden as early as possible is key. And as long as we have the plants and the habitat in place to support their livelihood, we will be able to do just that. So thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.